Story number 1.
Moving into a new home is supposed to be a fresh start. That's what Daniel and Lisa thought when they found the perfect house on the outskirts of town. It was an older Victorian-style home, 2 stories, with a large porch that wrapped around the front. The price was suspiciously low for its size, but the realtor assured them it was simply because the house had been on the market for too long. The moment they stepped inside, Lisa felt an odd sensation, like the air was heavier, as if the house held its breath. Daniel, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as the scent of an old home, the lingering dust of its long vacancy. "We can make this work," Lisa said, brushing off her unease. They moved in on a bright summer afternoon. The house felt warm in the sunlight, almost inviting. They spent the day unpacking, arranging furniture, and laughing about how they finally had their dream home. That night, exhaustion claimed them, and they collapsed into their bed, too tired to even pull the sheets up properly. Sometime after midnight, Lisa woke up with a start. She wasn't sure what had pulled her from sleep, but she felt an overwhelming sense of awareness. She lay there, frozen, ears straining. The house was silent, yet she swore she had heard something, a creaking floorboard. She turned her head toward the bedroom door. It was open. Hadn't she closed it before bed? The hallway was cloaked in darkness, but something felt off. It was as if the darkness itself was watching her. She held her breath, waiting. Then another creak, closer this time. She reached out and shook Daniel's arm. "Danny," she whispered, "wake up." He grumbled and turned over. "What?" "I heard something." Lisa saw the annoyance flicker across his face, but then he must have noticed her expression. He sat up, listening. Silence. Lisa exhaled, feeling silly. "I swear I heard something walking in the hall." Daniel sighed, rubbing his eyes. "It's an old house. It's probably settling." He lay back down, pulling the blanket up. "Go to sleep." Lisa tried, but for the rest of the night, she swore she could feel something standing just beyond the doorway. Over the next few days, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Objects seemed to move. Her keys weren't where she left them. Doors she had closed were suddenly open. The worst was the feeling. It was always there, watching. Daniel remained unconvinced. "It's just your imagination," he said. "New house jitters." One evening, while he was at work, Lisa decided to unpack the last few boxes. She was in the upstairs hallway, placing books onto a shelf when she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the stairs. She froze, heart hammering, as the sound moved closer. She turned her head just as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Nothing was there. A cold shiver ran down her spine, and she forced a nervous laugh. "Jesus, Lisa, get a grip." She turned back to the bookshelf. The whisper was so soft that at first she thought it was just the wind, but the voice was unmistakable. "Leave." Lisa dropped the book and spun around. The hallway was empty. She backed away, grabbing her phone, hands shaking. She dialed Daniel. "Hey, babe," he answered. "Danny," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "Something's wrong with this house." A pause. Then, "What happened?" she told him. About the footsteps, the whisper. He was silent for a long time before finally saying, "Lisa, it's stress. You're overworked, the move." "I know what I heard." "All right," he said, sighing. "I'll come home early, okay? Just stay calm." Lisa spent the next hour sitting in the living room, every light turned on. When Daniel got home, he found her curled up on the couch, pale. "Come on," he said, wrapping an arm around her. "Let's go to bed." Lisa didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Daniel suggested they go into town, take a break from the house. Lisa eagerly agreed. A small antique shop caught her attention and she wandered inside, browsing absent-mindedly. "You new in town?" The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, asked. "Yes," Lisa replied. "Just moved in a week ago." "Whereabouts?" Lisa hesitated. The house on Sycamore, the old Victorian." The woman's face darkened. "You should leave." Lisa's stomach dropped. "Excuse me, that house isn't safe," the woman said. "Terrible things have happened there." Lisa leaned in. "What kind of things?" The woman sighed. "Years ago, a man lived there with his wife and daughter. He was a drunk, violent. The wife tried to leave one night with the little girl, but he caught them. The neighbors heard screams. By the time the police arrived, it was too late." She shook her head. "He killed them both, then himself." Lisa's mouth went dry. "I didn't know." "No one lasts long in that house," the woman warned. "They always leave." Lisa left the shop feeling like the air had been knocked out of her. She told Daniel everything. That's just a story, he argued. People love to make up ghost tales about old houses. Lisa wasn't convinced. Danny, what if it's real? What if... I'm not leaving over some old rumors, he said firmly. Lisa didn't push, but that night, the house pushed back. It started with the whispering, soft at first, a distant voice. Lisa lay awake, gripping the blanket. Then the footsteps. But this time, they didn't stop at the door. They entered the room. Lisa's breath caught as the air grew frigid. The darkness seemed to deepen, stretch toward her. And then Daniel gasped, jerking upright. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Lisa nodded, unable to speak. Something moved at the foot of their bed. Then the whisper came again, right beside her ear. "Leave." The door slammed shut. Lisa screamed. Daniel jumped out of bed, this fumbling for the light. It flicked on, and the room was empty. But the closet door was open. They didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The following day, Lisa had enough. She began packing. "I don't care what you say," she told Daniel. "I'm leaving." But Daniel, now finally unsettled, didn't argue. That night, as they finished packing, Lisa found a small door in the hallway, partially hidden behind a bookshelf. Curious, she pulled it open. A narrow staircase led down into darkness. "Danny," she called, swallowing hard. "Come look at this." Daniel stepped beside her, eyes narrowing. A basement? But there had been no mention of a basement in the house listing. A sense of dread pooled in Lisa's stomach, but Daniel grabbed a flashlight and started down. Lisa hesitated, then followed. The basement was small, filled with dust and old, broken furniture. But at the far end of the room stood something that made Lisa's breath hitch. A child's rocking chair. It faced the wall. Daniel moved toward it slowly, the flashlight beam shaking. He reached out. The chair rocked. Lisa screamed. The flashlight flickered, then died. Darkness swallowed them. And in the darkness, the whisper returned. But this time, it wasn't a warning. It was laughter. Cold, cruel laughter. Lisa bolted up the stairs, dragging Daniel with her. Or was that? They slammed the door shut and ran out of the house. They never went back. A week later, the house was listed for sale again, and the whispers continued to wait for the next owners. Story the end.
Story number 2.
Moving into a new house is always a blend of excitement and apprehension. But for Heather and Tom, their new home was meant to be a fresh start. They had just gotten married and found a beautiful 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house had been empty for a few months, which was perfect since it gave them plenty of time to make it their own. It was an older house, built in the early 1900s, but had been recently renovated. New hardwood floors, freshly painted walls, and a large, bright kitchen that Heather had always dreamed of. The first week in the house was peaceful. The couple unpacked their boxes, rearranged the furniture, and spent their evenings on the porch with glasses of wine, watching the sunset. They laughed at the creaky floors, the old wood that gave the house character. Every house has its quirks, they thought. But then the noises began. At first it was subtle. Tom, who worked from home, had his office set up in a small room upstairs. On the first day, he thought he heard someone walking around downstairs while he was on a conference call. He assumed it was Heather, but when he went downstairs to check, he found the house completely empty. Maybe the house is just settling, he thought, brushing it off. That night, Heather noticed a strange sound coming from the kitchen. It was like the soft clinking of dishes. She stood in the hallway, listening. The sound was faint, but clear. She walked into the kitchen, fully expecting to find Tom there, maybe putting away some dishes. But the kitchen was empty, the sink still full of water from earlier. She shrugged it off, assuming it was just her imagination. The next morning, as Heather was getting ready for work, she couldn't find her keys. She looked everywhere, on the kitchen counter, on the hall table, in her purse, but they were gone. Frustrated, she asked Tom if he'd seen them. He hadn't. She searched the house again, calling out for her keys as if they might just appear out of nowhere. After about an hour, she found them in the bathroom, hidden behind a pile of towels. She didn't know how they got there. That night, as they sat on the couch watching TV, they heard a loud bang from upstairs. They both froze. It sounded like something had fallen, or maybe a door had slammed. Tom quickly got up and went to check, but again, there was nothing. There was no sign of anything being disturbed. "I'm sure it's just the wind," he said, though his voice was tinged with uncertainty. Heather wasn't convinced. She hadn't heard the wind, and the house felt unnervingly still. The days went on, and the strange occurrences only intensified. Heather started to wake up in the middle of the night, hearing soft whispers coming from the hallway. She would sit up in bed, straining to hear, but as soon as she did, the whispers stopped. At the first time it happened, she convinced herself it was just a dream, but after it happened a few more times, she couldn't ignore it any longer. She told Tom, who was understandably skeptical, "It's just the house settling, or maybe the pipes. Old houses make all sorts of noises." But Heather wasn't sure anymore. She wasn't imagining the whispers. They sounded so real, so clear. One morning, Heather found a strange stain on the carpet in the corner of the living room. And it was small, almost like a water stain, but when she tried to clean it, it wouldn't come out. It wasn't that she was a neat freak, but this was the first time she'd seen something like it in a house that was supposed to be freshly renovated. She showed it to Tom, and he tried scrubbing it too. They even called a carpet cleaner, but the stain remained. The final straw came one evening when Tom was upstairs in his office and Heather was alone in the living room. Thus, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, slow steps moving across the floor above her. She stood frozen, heart pounding. "Tom?" she called out. But there was no answer. She stood up, walked cautiously to the stairs, and called for him again. No response. She slowly climbed the stairs and checked each room. Tom wasn't in the office. He wasn't anywhere on the second floor. "Tom!" she yelled. Her voice echoed in the quiet house. Suddenly, she felt a cold breeze there, and the door to the guest bedroom slammed shut with a loud bang. She jumped back, terrified. Tom's voice came from downstairs. "What's going on? I was in the kitchen. I just heard a door slam." Heather didn't know what to say. She walked downstairs in a daze, still shaken by the experience. Tom had a puzzled look on his face. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Heather could barely speak. "It wasn't you upstairs?" "No, I was downstairs this whole time," Tom replied, his brow furrowed. The house felt different now. The silence felt oppressive, like something was watching them. They both started noticing more things out of place. The refrigerator door would open by itself. Furniture would be moved slightly, just enough to make them wonder if their memories were failing them. But what bothered them the most were the shadows. At night, Heather would often catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye, a shadow moving across the wall just before the lights flickered and went out. It wasn't a trick of the light, and it wasn't the shadows of trees outside. This was something far darker. One night, Heather was cleaning the kitchen when she heard something upstairs. The sound of footsteps again, but this time they were heavier, more deliberate. She grabbed her phone and called Tom, her hands shaking. "Tom, please come home. I think something's in the house." Tom's voice was calm, though there was a hint of concern. "I'm on my way. Just stay there and lock the door." Heather was terrified, but she did as he asked. As she waited, the noises grew louder. The footsteps were now pacing in the hallway, and she could hear a faint whispering like voices calling out her name. The doorbell rang, and Heather jumped, her breath catching in her throat. She quickly looked through the peephole. No one was there, but the noises continued, the whispers, the pacing. And when Tom arrived, they searched the house together. There was nothing. "Nothing's here, Heather," Tom said, frustrated. But Heather wasn't convinced. She was certain something was in the house, something old, something angry. Over the following days, Heather and Tom couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The house felt wrong, as though something had taken root in the very walls. They called a local paranormal investigator, hoping for answers. The investigator, a man named Mike, arrived with his equipment. He set up cameras, audio recorders, and motion sensors throughout the house. After a few hours, he played back some of the recordings for them. The first few recordings were just static, but then they heard it, the same whispers Heather had been hearing. The voices were clear, distinct, and they were calling out Heather's name. "I'm not crazy," Heather said, relieved but still terrified. But things only got worse. The investigator found an old journal hidden in the attic, a journal from a previous owner of the house. It told the story of a family that had lived in the house in the late 1800s. The family had suffered a great tragedy. A child had died unexpectedly, and soon after, the mother went mad, claiming she could hear the child's voice calling her from the walls. The journal ended abruptly, and the last entry was chilling. I hear her again in the walls. She's waiting for me to join her. That night, as Heather and Tom sat in their living room, they heard it. Soft, slow footsteps coming from the hallway, and then the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter, faint and distant. The investigator had told them that the house's history was cursed, that the spirits trapped inside couldn't move on, and now they knew they couldn't stay. The next morning, Heather and Tom packed their things and left the house. They never returned. And a few weeks later, the house went back on the market. The realtor didn't mention anything about the history of the house, but the couple knew they would never be the ones to buy it again. Some houses, no matter how beautiful, carry the weight of their past, and some spirits are not so easily forgotten. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I had always dreamed of owning my own house, a place where I could settle down, build memories, and create a sanctuary. After years of renting cramped apartments, I finally saved enough to buy my first home, a beautiful old house on the outskirts of town. It was a 3-bedroom colonial-style building with a large front yard, towering trees, and a classic charm that drew me in immediately. The moment I stepped inside, I felt something unusual, an eerie presence that clung to the walls, but I brushed it off as my imagination. After all, it was just an old house. The previous owners had been an elderly couple, and from the way the house was kept, it was clear they had lived there for decades. The floors creaked with every step, the wallpaper was peeling in places, and the air had a musty smell, but there was something warm about it too. The house felt like it had a history, like it had witnessed so many moments of joy, sorrow, and life unfolding within its walls. I moved in on a chilly autumn afternoon, the sky painted with shades of orange and pink. The day was beautiful, and I thought it would be the perfect start to my new life. I unpacked my things, set up my furniture, and even started planning a garden for the spring. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house fell into darkness, I began to feel that strange sense of unease creeping back into my thoughts. I dismissed the feeling again, thinking it was just the nerves of starting fresh in an unfamiliar place. But that night, something happened that I couldn't explain. As I settled into bed, I heard a soft thud coming from upstairs, followed by what sounded like footsteps. I froze, listening intently. There was no way anyone could be up there. No one had been in the house before me for months, and I was sure all the doors were locked. The house had no tenants except for me, yet the sounds persisted, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking in heavy boots. My heart raced as I slowly got out of bed and crept toward the staircase. The house was unnervingly silent now. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for what felt like an eternity, my mind spinning with a dozen explanations. Maybe it was just the house settling, the wind making the old timber creak, or even the pipes making noise. But the footsteps didn't stop. They came closer. I swallowed hard and, against my better judgment, began to ascend the stairs. With each step, the creaking of the wood beneath my feet seemed deafening. The air was thick with a chill that I couldn't shake, even though the heat was on. I reached the top of the stairs and walked down the narrow hallway, my flashlight shaking in my hand. When I reached the last bedroom, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with a trembling hand, expecting to find nothing. But there, standing in the center of the room, was a figure. A tall, shadowy figure, dressed in what appeared to be old-fashioned clothing, as if they had stepped out of a different era. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. It simply stood there, motionless, its face hidden in darkness. My breath caught in my throat. I felt frozen to the spot, unable to move or scream. The air grew colder still, and a sense of dread settled over me, so thick I could almost taste it. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Maybe I had imagined it, I thought. Maybe I was exhausted, or maybe the house had played a trick on me. I quickly left the room, locked the door, and returned to my own bedroom, convincing myself that it had all been a dream. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. Over the next few days, I began to notice small things out of place. Objects moved when I was sure I had left them in a specific spot, a faint whispering noise that I couldn't place, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. At night, I would hear the footsteps again, always coming from above. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the house settling, the wind, or the natural creaks of an old building. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One evening, I decided to confront the house. Armed with a camera, a notebook, and a growing sense of dread, I set out to document everything. I moved through each room, inspecting every corner, every crevice, trying to find some logical explanation for the strange events. But nothing stood out. The house was just as it had always been, old, but solid. When I reached the attic, I felt a sudden surge of unease. I had never been up there, but I had heard rumors about the place. The locals mentioned the previous owners had kept to themselves, and some of the older residents whispered about strange happenings. It wasn't until later that I learned that the elderly couple had no family, and after their death, the house had been abandoned for years. The attic was dark, the air thick with dust and stale wood. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight over the cluttered space. Boxes, old furniture, and forgotten belongings were scattered across the floor. As I walked deeper into the attic, my flashlight flickered. I cursed under my breath and checked the batteries. When the light returned, I gasped. On the far wall, barely visible in the dim light, was a large framed photograph. I approached it cautiously, my hands trembling. The photo was old, the edges yellowed with age, but the image was unmistakable. It was of the previous owners, the elderly couple, but there was something strange about the photo. Behind them, barely visible in the background, was a shadowy figure, just like the one I had seen in the bedroom. My stomach churned. I pulled the photo from the wall and turned it over. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "We are not alone." I immediately left the attic, my heart racing. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on me. The house felt suffocating, as if it were alive, watching me, waiting. The footsteps became more frequent, and the whispers more distinct. It wasn't just in the house anymore. I could hear them outside, in the yard, in the trees. I reached out to a local paranormal investigator, someone I had heard about from the neighbors. When he arrived, he seemed strangely familiar with the house. He said the place had a reputation, a history of unexplained events, and he had heard stories about the elderly couple who had lived there. He mentioned that the house had once belonged to a family long ago, and some believed that the spirits of the past still lingered, trapped in the walls. He set up equipment in the house that night, cameras, EVP recorders, and infrared sensors. As we sat in the living room, the house was still, almost too still. The only sound was the occasional hum of the equipment. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. The lights flickered, and the atmosphere became thick, heavy, oppressive. And then the footsteps began again, louder this time. They came from upstairs, from the same room where I had seen the figure. My breath caught in my throat as the investigator motioned for me to follow. We crept upstairs, our footsteps muffled by the eerie silence of the house. The door to the bedroom was wide open, just as I had left it. But something was different. The air felt thick with a palpable tension, and the shadows in the room seemed to move on their own. As we stepped inside, the EVP recorder captured faint, distorted voices, whispers that were impossible to understand, but filled with a sense of malice. The investigator paused, his eyes narrowing as he listened. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I nodded, my heart pounding. "What is it?" He didn't answer, his face paling. He turned to me slowly. "Whatever is here, it's not friendly, and it's not going to leave." The next few days were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't escape the feeling that something was always lurking just beyond my sight. The investigator told me the spirits in the house had attached themselves to it, feeding off the energy of the living. They would never leave, and neither would I, until I made a choice. I couldn't stay any longer. I left the house in the dead of night, abandoning all my belongings, unable to shake the feeling that it had claimed me, that I had become part of its history. The house still stands today, empty and silent, waiting for the next person to come and uncover its secrets. But I know better now. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some spirits never leave. And some houses, no matter how beautiful, are better left abandoned. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The first time Sarah stepped into the house, she felt something was off. It wasn't something she could put her finger on. just a feeling, a subtle unease that prickled the back of her neck. The house was beautiful, a late 19th century Victorian with towering ceilings, intricate woodwork, and a grand staircase that seemed to belong in an old movie. It had been on the market for a surprisingly low price, and despite the rumors about its history, Sarah and her husband Mark had decided it was the perfect place to start their new life. The first few nights were quiet, almost eerily so. The house seemed to absorb sound, making even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seem unnaturally loud. On the third night, as Sarah lay in bed, she heard it for the first time. Soft footsteps, faint, like someone walking across the upstairs hallway. She nudged Mark awake. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Mark groaned and pulled the covers over his head. "It's an old house, Sarah. It settles. Go to sleep." Sarah tried to brush it off, but the sounds continued over the next few nights. Soft whispers just at the edge of her hearing, like someone was speaking but didn't want to be heard. Doors that she knew she had shut would be found open in the morning. The rocking chair in the corner of the nursery, the room they planned to turn into a study, would sometimes be facing the wall when she was sure she had left it facing the window. One evening, as she was making dinner, she heard the unmistakable sound of laughter coming from upstairs. It was high-pitched, childlike. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she turned off the stove and slowly made her way up the stairs. The hallway was dimly lit by the antique sconces they had restored, casting flickering shadows against the wallpaper. She reached the nursery and froze. The rocking chair was moving. Not violently, not in an exaggerated horror movie way, but just slightly, like someone had just been sitting in it and stood up moments before she arrived. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She backed out of the room and closed the door. That night, she told Mark everything. He sighed and pulled her close. "It's just your imagination, babe. You're stressed with the move and the renovations. I promise there's nothing here." She wanted to believe him. She really did. A few nights later, Mark woke up gasping. Sarah sat up, terrified. "What's wrong?" she asked. He was pale, his skin clammy. I had a nightmare. A little girl. She was standing at the foot of the bed, just staring at me. Her face was..." He stopped and shook his head. It felt so real. Sarah swallowed hard. "What did she look like?" He hesitated. "I don't know. Her eyes were just wrong, like they were too dark, and she didn't blink." Neither of them slept well after that. The next day, Sarah decided to do some research on the house. She went to the local library and dug into old newspapers. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for. In 1902, a little girl named Eleanor had lived in the house with her parents. She was only 8 when she went missing. The newspaper said she had vanished one night from her bedroom, and despite weeks of searching, no trace of her was ever found. Her parents, devastated, moved away a year later. Over the decades, different owners had come and gone, and many reported strange occurrences. Whispers, laughter, objects moving on their own. Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. When she got home, she told Mark everything. He was silent for a long time before finally saying, "Maybe we should bless the house, just in case." They called in a local priest who walked through each room, sprinkling holy water and saying prayers. For a while, things seemed better. The house felt lighter, less oppressive. Then one night, everything changed. Sarah woke to the feeling of something pressing down on her chest. She gasped for air, unable to move. A shadow loomed over her, barely distinguishable in the darkness. It had no clear shape, just a mass of something heavy, suffocating. Her vision blurred as she struggled to breathe, and just when she thought she was going to pass out, the pressure lifted. She bolted upright, gasping. The room was still. Mark was fast asleep beside her. She shook him awake, sobbing. "It was here, Mark. It was on top of me." He sat up, rubbing his face. "Jesus, Sarah, are you sure it wasn't sleep paralysis?" "I know what I felt," she snapped. "Something is in this house." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "Then maybe we should leave." That was the first time they seriously considered it. Over the next few days, things escalated. The whispers turned into full sentences, faint but unmistakable. "Help me. Please. Don't leave me." Sarah started seeing movement out of the corner of her eye, small glimpses of a girl in a white dress standing just beyond her line of sight. Objects began flying off shelves. Lights flickered. Doors slammed shut on their own. One evening, as she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, she saw her. She saw her. A small girl stood behind her in the reflection, her face pale, her dark eyes sunken. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Sarah spun around, but the room was empty. That was it. That was the breaking point. They packed their things that night. As they carried boxes to the car, Sarah felt the air grow cold around her. She turned back to the house, and there, in the upstairs window, Eleanor stood watching them, a sadness in her dark, hollow eyes. As Mark slammed the trunk shut, Sarah heard it, soft, barely audible over the wind. "Don't leave me." They never looked back. The house was eventually sold again. The new owners moved in, just like they had, and just like Sarah and Mark, they too began to hear the whispers. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I had always dreamed of owning a house, a place of my own where I could finally start fresh. After years of living in cramped apartments, I was thrilled to find a new house that I could call my own. It was a modest 2-story home, newly built, tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The moment I walked in, I felt a sense of peace. It was everything I had hoped for, bright, clean, and full of potential. The house was freshly painted, with soft light streaming in through the large windows. The hardwood floors gleamed, and the smell of new construction was still in the air. There was a sense of possibility in every corner, as if the house itself was waiting for someone to make it a home. And that's exactly what I intended to do. The first few weeks were blissful. I unpacked my belongings, settled in, and made the space my own. I didn't have many friends in the area yet, but the quiet solitude felt comforting. It was just me and the house, getting to know each other. But one evening, about a month after I had moved in, things began to feel different. It started with small things, objects slightly out of place, doors that weren't quite shut the way I remembered them. At first, I dismissed them as forgetfulness. I was still adjusting to the new routine, still learning the layout of the house. Maybe I was absent-minded and didn't remember leaving a cabinet open or a light on. But soon it became more than that. One night, I was sitting in the living room watching TV when I heard a sound coming from upstairs. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder as I listened. It sounded like footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor above me. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, staring up at the ceiling. I told myself it was nothing. The house was new. There was no reason to believe something was wrong. It was probably the house settling, the sound of the wooden floors creaking. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, moving back and forth across the floor above, as if someone was pacing the hall. I stood up, my pulse quickening. Slowly I walked toward the stairs and looked up. The hallway was dark and there was no sign of anyone. I hesitated, but the curiosity got the best of me. I climbed the stairs and checked every room. There was nothing out of place. No one was there. The house was empty, just as I had left it. I felt foolish for being scared. It was just the house settling, I told myself. I tried to brush it off and went to bed that night, but the sense of unease lingered. I had heard the footsteps so clearly. They had sounded too real to be just a creak of the house. The following days brought more strange occurrences. I would wake up to find doors open that I had left closed the night before. My keys, which I always placed on the kitchen counter, would sometimes be found on the living room table, or worse, on the floor. I tried to convince myself that I was just forgetful, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't until I came home one evening to a scene I couldn't explain that I started to seriously question my perception of reality. I had been out for a few hours, and when I returned, I immediately noticed something was off. The door to the kitchen was wide open, and the faint smell of something burnt lingered in the air. I stepped inside, calling out, but there was no answer. The house felt cold, too cold for a summer evening. The temperature dropped noticeably as I moved further into the house, my breath coming out in small clouds. I flicked on the light and looked around. On the kitchen counter, I found a glass of water, spilled and dripping, as if someone had set it down in a hurry. And next to it, the stove was on. The burner was glowing orange, but no one had been there to turn it on. My heart began to race as I looked around the kitchen, my eyes scanning every corner. There were no signs of forced entry. No one had been in the house but me. So who turned on the stove? And why had they left everything in such a hurry? I turned off the burner, my hands shaking. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to make of it. There was no explanation for what I was experiencing. I had lived alone for years, and this was the first time something like this had ever happened. That night, I tried to tell myself it was just a series of odd coincidences. Maybe I had accidentally left the burner on earlier and just didn't remember. Maybe the door had blown open in the wind. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Over the next few weeks, the occurrences continued. The footsteps above me became more frequent, and sometimes I would hear faint whispers, like voices, low and unintelligible, coming from the dark corners of the house. I would hear them when I was alone, sitting quietly in the living room, or when I was in bed, trying to sleep. At first, the whispers were so quiet that I couldn't make out the words, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. One night, I heard a voice call my name. It was soft at first, just a whisper, but then it grew louder, as if someone was standing right next to me. Rachel? I froze. My name. It was unmistakable. My heart leapt in my chest, and I whipped my head around, but there was no one there. I looked toward the stairs, expecting to see someone standing at the top, but the house was empty. The air was thick with silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was happening, so I decided to do some research. I went to the local library and asked about the history of the house, though I had a feeling that I wouldn't like the answers. The librarian pulled out a file for me, containing a brief history of the land. It turned out that the house had been built on property that was once part of an old farm. The farm had been abandoned in the early 1900s after the owners, an elderly couple, had both died under mysterious circumstances. There was no record of their deaths, no obituary, nothing. It was as if they had simply vanished. I asked the librarian if there had been any rumors or stories about the farm before it was abandoned, but she only shook her head. There wasn't much to go on, but she did mention that the house was sold a few times before I moved in. No one had stayed long. A few families had lived there, but they all moved out after a year or two, citing strange occurrences, things moving on their own, odd noises, and feelings of being watched. I left the library feeling uneasy, as if a piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Something about this house, this land, was wrong. It had a history that no one wanted to acknowledge, and I was living in the shadow of it. That night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. I was done being afraid. I stood in the living room, the air thick with tension, and spoke aloud, demanding answers. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why are you here?" For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, as if in response, the air grew colder, and the footsteps started again. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I looked toward the stairs, my heart racing in my chest. But this time, something was different. The footsteps were not just above me. They were coming down the stairs, getting closer, closer to where I stood. I felt a cold breeze brush past me, and before I could react, the front door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. I jumped back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The house was alive with sound. The footsteps, the whispers, the sound of doors slamming shut. It was as if the house was rejecting me, pushing me out, unwilling to let me stay. I ran to the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and wrenched it open. I bolted into the night, the cool air helping to clear my head, but the fear clung to me. I couldn't go back inside. Not then. Not ever. I spent the rest of the night at a friend's house, too shaken to return to my own home. The next day, I went to a local paranormal investigator, someone who had helped other families in the area. They confirmed what I had suspected. The house was haunted. The spirits of the elderly couple who had died there still lingered, and they weren't happy with the new owners. I tried to ignore the house after that, but the thought of it haunted me every day. I eventually moved out, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The new owners, whoever they were free to deal with whatever had taken up residence there. I just couldn't stay. Years later, I drove past the house. It looked the same, with its white trim and big windows, but I knew better than to think it was just a house. It was a place where something darker lingered, a house with a history that I was better off leaving behind. Story. The end.
Story number 6.
When David and Claire moved into their new home, they weren't thinking about ghosts. They had found the house after months of searching. a beautiful colonial-style home sitting on a quiet street in a small town. It was bigger than what they had originally planned for, but the price had been too good to pass up. The previous owners had left in a hurry, or so their real estate agent had mentioned in passing, but that didn't bother them. People moved for all sorts of reasons. The first few days were spent unpacking and settling in. The house needed some work, peeling wallpaper in the upstairs bedrooms, creaky floorboards in the hallway, but nothing out of the ordinary for an old home. It had character, as Claire liked to put it. The first sign that something wasn't right came a week after moving in. It was late at night, and David had just gone to bed when he heard Claire calling his name from downstairs. He groaned, rolled over, and checked the time, 1:47 a.m. He dragged himself out of bed, rubbing his eyes as he headed down the stairs. "Claire? What's wrong?" Silence. The living room was empty. So was the kitchen. Confused, he turned toward the staircase. That's when he saw Claire standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at him. "Why were you calling me?" he asked. She frowned. "I wasn't." David hesitated. "I heard you, clear as day." Claire shook her head. "I was asleep." A chill ran down David's spine. He laughed it off, mumbling something about maybe hearing the TV from next door, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. The next night, Claire was the one who heard something. She had been in bed reading when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside their bedroom. Slow, deliberate steps as though someone was pacing. She thought it was David, but when she turned to say something, she found him fast asleep beside her. Her heart pounded as she listened, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped just outside their door. She waited, expecting a knock, but nothing happened. She sat up, straining her ears. "David?" she whispered. No response. Gathering her courage, she reached for the lamp and switched it on. The hallway beyond the slightly open door was empty. She lay awake for hours after that, unable to shake the feeling that someone had been standing just outside their room. Over the next few days, the house felt different. They both sensed it, but didn't talk about it at first. The air was heavier, the rooms colder in certain spots. Claire started finding objects moved from where she had left them. A coffee mug on the counter would be in the sink minutes later. David's wallet, which he had left on the nightstand, appeared on the kitchen table the next morning. And then came the dreams. David woke one night covered in sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. In his dream, he had been standing in the hallway staring at their bedroom door. But he hadn't been alone. Something had been behind him, breathing against his neck. He could still feel it even after waking. Claire's nightmares were worse. She dreamed of a woman standing at the foot of their bed, her face obscured by shadows. The woman never moved, never spoke, just stood there, watching. After a few weeks, they could no longer pretend everything was fine. Claire was in the kitchen one evening when she felt a presence behind her. She turned, expecting to see David, but no one was there. She laughed at herself, shook her head, and went back to chopping vegetables. Then she felt it again, this time closer. The hairs on her arms stood up and her breath hitched. Slowly, she turned her head just enough to glance over her shoulder. A figure stood in the doorway. Not David. Not anyone she recognized. A tall, thin man in old-fashioned clothes, his face blurred, as though she were seeing him through frosted glass. She gasped, stumbling backward, knocking the knife off the counter. The figure didn't move, didn't react. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. She barely heard David running in from the living room. "What happened?" he asked, seeing her pale face. I saw someone," she whispered. David checked the house, every room, every closet. All the doors were still locked, the windows shut. That night, they slept with the lights on. The house wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to whatever else was inside it. One evening, while David was at work, Claire sat on the couch watching TV, trying to distract herself. Shadow, their cat, lay curled up next to her, purring softly. Then, without warning, Shadow bolted upright, his fur standing on end. He stared at the darkened hallway leading to the stairs, his eyes wide and unblinking. Claire followed his gaze, but the hallway was empty. Then she heard it, a soft whisper, too quiet to understand. Shadow let out a low growl, something he had never done before, and leapt off the couch, running to hide under the coffee table. Claire's blood ran cold. She turned off the TV, straining to hear. The whispering grew louder. It was coming from upstairs. Claire grabbed her phone, her hands trembling, and called David. "You need to come home," she whispered. "Right now." David didn't argue. He broke every speed limit getting back, but by the time he arrived, the house was silent again. Claire sat in the car outside, refusing to go back in. They decided to call someone, a paranormal investigator, a priest, anyone who could help. A local paranormal researcher named Andrew came the next day. He walked through the house, taking notes, setting up audio recorders. "I think whatever is here isn't just one spirit," he said. "There's something old in this house, and I don't think it likes that you're here." He played back one of the recordings he had taken in the hallway. The whispering was there, but now they could hear words. "Leave," the voice hissed. Claire burst into tears. That night, they packed their bags and left. The next morning, David returned to the house alone to grab a few more things. The house was eerily quiet without Claire there. As he walked through the hallway, he swore he heard footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, but of course, no one was there. Then, just as he was about to leave, he glanced up at the stairs. A woman stood at the top, the same one from Claire's dreams. Her dark hair hung in front of her face, her body slightly swaying as if caught in a slow breeze. David felt paralyzed. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, the woman lifted her head slightly. Her mouth opened, and the scream that came from her wasn't human. David ran. They never returned. The house went back on the market a few months later, and someone else moved in. Story the end.